In einer der elegantesten Veranstaltungen des Jahres im Herzen Berlins, während die Scheinwerfer auf den roten Teppich strahlten und die Kameras blitzten, schob Markus Müller, ein Janitor, Reinigungsarbeiter, still seinen Reinigungswagen durch die stillen Korridore des hochherrschaftlichen Schloss Berlin. Die Gäste trugen teure Abendkleider und prunkvolle Anzüge, während Geschichten von Großzügigkeit und Wohlstand durch den Raum flossen, genauso wie der Champagner. Doch diejenigen, die die Böden polierten und den Raum sauber hielten, schienen unsichtbar zu sein. Markus, ein Mann, der seit Jahren diesen Raum polierte, der stets den unsichtbaren Dienst tat, wusste, dass er in dieser Welt keinen Platz hatte. Die PR-Fachfrau, die mit ihrem Clipboard vorbeiging, sagte höflich, aber bestimmt: „Stellen Sie sicher, dass das Personal nicht im Bild zu sehen ist." Es war, als ob es eine unausgesprochene Regel gab. Die Lichter leuchten nur auf bestimmten Menschen. Das Personal, das hart arbeitete, um die prachtvollen Bilder zu ermöglichen, wurde kaum bemerkt, geschweige denn in den Fokus gerückt. Plötzlich trat die Millionärin Clara Schmidt auf. Ihre edlen Diamanten glitzerten unter den Lichtern der Kronleuchter. Ihr rotes Kleid flimmerte im Scheinwerferlicht, als sie an das Mikrofon trat und mit einer lauten, präzisen Stimme erklärte: „Heute Abend sind wir hier, um uns gegenseitig zu erinnern, dass es immer Hoffnung gibt." Ihre Worte, die in den Raum hallten, ließen die Gäste höflich klatschen. Doch Markus, der in der Ecke des Raumes stand und Gläser sammelte, konnte die Wahrheit hinter diesen Worten erkennen. Die wahre Hoffnung existiert für die Menschen wie ihn nicht in diesen Räumen. Als Clara an ihm vorbeiging und versehentlich ein Glas umwarf, spritzte der Champagner auf ihr teures Kleid. „Was haben Sie da getan?" rief sie, ihre Stimme scharf wie Glas. Ein kleiner Moment der Aufmerksamkeit, der die gesamte Atmosphäre des Abends verändern sollte. „Es tut mir leid, meine Dame", sagte Markus ruhig. „Ich werde den Schaden bezahlen." Doch Clara, die immer die Kontrolle hatte, entgegnete: „Was hältst du davon, wenn du das Klavier spielst? Besser als ein Profi? Dann heirate ich dich." Ihre Worte, die ein Spiel und eine Herausforderung darstellten, zeigten die tiefe Kluft zwischen den Welten der Reichen und den Armen. Sie wollte ihn erniedrigen, in einer schönen Geste, die ihre Macht zur Schau stellte. Doch Markus war mehr als nur ein Angestellter. Er hatte die Tasten eines Klaviers so gut wie niemand anders beherrscht, bevor das Leben ihn in den Dienst einer Gesellschaft gezwungen hatte, die nur wenig für solche Talente übrig hatte. Er war nicht dort, um sich zu verstecken, sondern um zu zeigen, wer er wirklich war. „Ich will nicht, dass Sie mich heiraten", sagte er ruhig. „Ich möchte nur, dass Sie Ihr Wort halten." Die Gäste lachten, aber Markus' ruhige Entschlossenheit ließ die Luft im Raum verdichten. „Ich werde spielen", sagte Markus, „aber Sie halten Ihr Wort ein, was auch immer es ist." Der Raum, der vorher von Gelächter und Spott erfüllt war, begann plötzlich in eine andere Richtung zu kippen. Als Markus die Tasten des Pianos berührte, schien der gesamte Raum still zu werden. Jeder Ton war präzise, jeder Akkord durchdacht. Es war nicht mehr nur ein musikalischer Auftritt. Es war ein Akt der Selbstbestimmung, ein Moment der Wiedergutmachung. Markus spielte nicht für Applaus, nicht für Anerkennung. Er spielte, um sich selbst zu bestätigen und die Menschen um ihn herum zu lehren, was es bedeutet, den eigenen Wert zu erkennen. Clara, die sich zuvor sicher war, dass sie die Kontrolle hatte, begann langsam zu begreifen, dass sie in diesem Moment nichts mehr zu sagen hatte. „Mein Name ist Markus", sagte er schließlich, als der letzte Ton verklang. „Nicht Buddy." Die Menge, die sich vorher über ihn lustig gemacht hatte, begann zu verstummen und ein neuer Respekt wuchs in der Luft. Clara, die gezwungen war, ihre Worte vor den Zeugen zu überprüfen, die sie nicht mehr kontrollieren konnte, stand still, als die Bedeutung dieser Nacht tief in ihr einsickert. Was aus einer Geste der Überlegenheit begann, verwandelte sich in eine Lektion über Würde und Gerechtigkeit, die sie nie vergessen würde. It was a gala night in Berlin, where the city's elite gathered at the opulent Kaiserpalast Hotel. The spotlights swept across the red carpet, and cameras flashed in synchrony with the glimmer of high society smiles. The crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm, golden light as guests, adorned in their finest evening gowns and tuxedos, moved gracefully across the marble floors. The sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and polite applause mixed with the scent of expensive perfumes. It was the kind of event that displayed the best of Berlin's wealth and privilege. But the hands that polished the floors since dawn were all but invisible. Hannah Muller, a cleaning staff member, quietly pushed her trolley through a side corridor. She had worked at this prestigious hotel for 5 years. performing her duties with unwavering precision. She had learned the silent rules of the space, the way the guests never really saw her, the cool nods that were never directed at her, and the way her presence was always minimized. The PR staff passed by, checking to make sure no staff appeared in photos. "Let's keep the staff out of the frame," a PR assistant said, with the professionalism of someone who had seen this directive repeated countless times. Her manager had casually reminded her, "Hannah, use the service elevator. Don't cross the main hall when guests are being photographed." Hannah was used to these reminders. Her existence had become a quiet dance around the edges of the spotlight, always avoiding being noticed. But tonight something would change. As she moved quietly around the hall, she caught a glimpse of the grand Steinway piano on the far end of the room, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier's golden glow. A memory flickered in her mind, sitting at the piano as a child, fingers brushing ivory keys. She paused for a moment but quickly turned away. Here she was invisible, her past lost in the shadows. Clara Schmidt, a billionaire businesswoman, made her grand entrance in a luxurious red gown that shimmered like a flame. Diamonds sparkled on her neck and wrists as she walked to the microphone, her voice clear and commanding as she addressed the crowd. "Tonight we come together to remind each other that there is always hope, and we can all contribute to making the world better," she declared. The applause was polite, as expected in these social circles. Meanwhile, Hannah continued to move along the periphery of the event, gathering glasses and cleaning up after guests, always careful not to disturb the polished image of the evening. As she bent down to pick up a glass, a small accident occurred. A drop of champagne splashed onto Clara's dress. The room paused for a moment. Clara turned sharply, her voice cutting through the air. "What have you done to my dress? Do you have any idea how much it costs?" The question, though unspoken, made clear the distance between their worlds. A businessman nearby snickered. A janitor could never afford the dry cleaning bill for that. Hannah remained calm. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am. I can cover the costs of the cleaning." But Clara wasn't interested in that. "How about this?" she said with a cold smile. "If you can play that piano better than a professional, I'll marry you." The room erupted with laughter at the absurdity of Tiyit, but Hannah, instead of retreating into invisibility, took a deep breath and replied, "I don't need you to marry me. If I play, I want you to keep your word." There was a brief moment of hesitation, then a chuckle from Clara. "Well then, prove it," she said. "Show us what you've got, buddy." Hannah walked toward the piano, every step deliberate. The room, still buzzing with laughter, started to shift as she sat at the piano and began to play. Each note was a declaration of self-worth, of being seen. Clara's smile faltered as the music filled the room, not with noise, but with purpose. As Hannah played, she wasn't just showcasing her musical talent. She was reclaiming her space in a world that had always pushed her aside. The guests who had laughed now listened, their cheers turning to quiet applause as they began to recognize the power in her performance. The night that began with mockery had now become a test of dignity. Hannah wasn't performing for applause, but for herself, to remind everyone that dignity doesn't wear a uniform. It has courage. She finished the piece, stood, and simply said, "My name is Hannah Muller, not Buddy." The room was silent. Clara, realizing the weight of her words, stood frozen for a moment. The laughter had stopped, replaced by an uncomfortable quiet. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was a lesson on respect, equality, and the power of keeping one's word. Clara had to face the consequences of her actions in front of everyone. In that moment, a reporter who had been watching from the sidelines leaned forward and said, "If she plays at a professional level, I'll say so to the press." The room was now fully engaged, their attention no longer on the spectacle, but on the substance of what had just unfolded. Clara, now visibly shaken, knew she had to make things right. With a deep breath, she stepped forward and addressed the room. "I was wrong," she said, her voice steady but regretful. "I disrespected Hannah Muller. I failed to treat her as an equal. I apologize unconditionally." The audience, still processing what had just transpired, began to applaud, not for the performance but for the apology. The night, which had begun with division and mockery, had transformed into a moment of redemption. Clara then turned to Hannah, who was still standing near the piano, her back straight and her hands calm. "I will keep my word," Clara said. And for the first time that night, her words carried weight. The cameras flashed again, capturing the moment of change. The rest of the night was spent in quiet reflection. The once glamorous event, now a symbol of a new beginning, a shift from privilege to equality. As Hannah left the hall, the staff members, who had remained invisible throughout the evening, were now seen. They were no longer shadows. They were individuals with their own dignity. The night had changed them all. In the heart of Berlin, within the iconic Berliner Palais Hotel, the lights blazed down on a high-profile gala. Guests adorned in elegant chignons and sharp tuxedos moved gracefully through the glittering hall, their smiles polished and practiced. Champagne flowed, and the air was thick with whispered promises of wealth and influence. Meanwhile, in the quieter corners of the event, Marcus Reed, a janitor, rolled his cleaning cart through the maze of polished marble floors. His years of training had taught him the unwritten rules of such events: the subtle glances, the polite but distant gestures, and the constant pressure to remain invisible. As he moved along the perimeter, careful not to disturb the glamour of the gala, his eyes wandered toward the grand piano at the far side of the room. It stood in the spotlight like a relic of a world he once belonged to, a world where his hands, once fluent in the language of Usik, had been silenced by the demands of survival. Victoria Schmidt, the billionaire philanthropist and socialite who organized the event, stood at the front of the room, her voice steady as she made a call for generosity. "Tonight we come together to remind each other that hope still lives," she said, her words drawing polite applause. As Marcus moved through the hall, a series of small moments marked his experience. Being asked to step out of the frame of photos, being given directions by staff who never seemed to look at him, and the ever-present sense that he didn't belong. But as he bent to pick up an empty glass near the grand piano, something happened. The glass slipped from his hands, and the crisp splash of champagne streaked across Victoria's elegant black dress. The room fell silent for a beat. Victoria's sharp words cut through the quiet. "Do you have any idea what this dress costs?" Her gaze, cold and dismissive, said more than her words ever could. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Marcus said calmly. "I'll cover the cleaning costs." But Victoria, accustomed to power and control, saw an opportunity to push further. "How about this?" she said, her smile razor sharp. "If you can play better than a professional pianist, I'll marry you." The room burst into laughter, a cruel ripple that seemed to validate her authority. But Marcus didn't retreat. He stepped forward, the silent pressure of the room tightening around him. "I don't need your marriage, Miss Schmidt, but I want you to keep your word." A challenge was laid down, one that the crowd responded to with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. Victoria pressed, her smile never wavering. "Show us then," she said, pressing her finger into the pulse of the room. Marcus walked toward the grand piano, his movements slow and deliberate, each step filled with a quiet purpose. As he sat down and placed his hands on the keys, the atmosphere shifted. No longer was he a janitor in the shadows, he was an artist reclaiming his space. He began to play, each note flowing with control and precision. His left hand, firm and rhythmic, drove the piece forward, while his right hand danced across the keys, the melody bending and folding like a tapestry. The audience, initially amused, fell silent as the music took hold. It wasn't just technical prowess, it was the sound of someone finding their voice after years of silence. The applause that followed wasn't polite, it was a recognition of his ability, of his dignity. The room stood, some slow, some hesitant, but in unison. Phones rose to capture the moment, but what was being captured wasn't just a spectacle, it was the reclaiming of a voice long ignored. Victoria stood frozen, her facade cracking as the weight of the moment pressed against her. Her mind raced with calculations of reputation, of shareholders, of optics. But the music refused to be confined by her plans. It filled the room, drawing attention to the humanity that had been invisible until now. As the applause began to dip, Marcus looked at Victoria, his gaze calm but unwavering. "You promised," he said, his voice carrying through the silence. "You said you would marry me if I played better than a professional. I'm not asking for your hand. I'm asking you to keep your word." Victoria hesitated, her gaze shifting between the crowd, the cameras, and her own internal dilemma. "You don't have to marry me," she said, a thin attempt to control the situation. But the room wasn't listening to her anymore. A voice from the back of the room broke the tension. An older woman, her tone clear and firm, called out, "You can keep your word, but you have to keep it." The words carried like a moral weight, anchoring the room in something more significant than any financial transaction or corporate deal. Victoria's mind raced. This wasn't just about a marriage promise anymore. It was about ethics, integrity, and the cost of words in a world where actions spoke louder than appearances. The applause grew louder, not for the performance, but for the moral stance that Marcus had taken. "I'm not here to perform for you," but Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'm here to show you that words mean something. If you can't keep your promise, then what does that say about the world we live in?" The room fell into a rare quiet, and it was in that moment that the shift happened. Victoria understood that her control had slipped, not because of the piano, but because the truth had entered the room. The truth that Marcus wasn't just a janitor, he was a human being with worth, with dignity. The phones buzzed with viral clips. Headlines flashed. Hashtag Marcus Reed, keep your word, hashtag ethics over power. The night had shifted, the room had changed, and the public's gaze had become not a tool for spectacle, but a force for accountability. Victoria, her mask cracked, turned to face Marcus. "What now?" she asked, her voice tired but sincere. Marcus didn't ask for much. "The right thing," he said. "Not a wedding, but respect. Keep your word, and this room will remember it." As the night unfolded, the story of Marcus Reed, a man who had been relegated to the shadows, became a symbol of integrity, the reminder that dignity has no uniform. And in the end, that was the most powerful performance of all.